Very good.
Sorry, I had sound turned off, but yes, I'm now recording seemingly to this computer.
Right. Okay. So the reason I'm late today and still on a train is that I originally had lunch with one of my very first students, also one of my absolutely brightest students whom I hadn't seen in a few years. So that was nice. She needed to work somewhere, so we went to the Royal Society where I'm a member. I was just going to park her on a desk, but it turned out there was some kind of a VR thing happening, so obviously I had to stay for that. And are you all familiar with the overview effects? In other words, the thing that astronauts, when they look at Earth, they get overwhelmed with all kinds of positive emotions about the planet. So this VR experience was all about that. It was about how can we use VR to give people the overview effect so that they become more environmentally conscious. I felt the actual VR was not as good as it could have been, but it was really interesting that someone's doing this as a proper thing and they're really evangelizing it. You know, there are many specifics that I don't think they did write something with the clouds and narration and all of that stuff. For crying out loud, sorry, loud trains. Can you guys hear me okay, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So I just thought, obviously we've talked about doing globes and stuff, but I think, I don't know, to see what you guys feel, maybe we think a little bit about doing, let's say, Google Earth for VR. And we think about what that would mean, like a little bit of physics. You can't just flip the planet around, but quite a few years ago, I had an app for iPad called InterAtlas. All it was a globe with no labels on it at all that you could spin around, do whatever you wanted to. But if you touched something, let's say a country, it would then draw the borders around that country and add the label. And you could touch as many countries as you wanted, or oceans. And if you touch them again, they disappeared. However, if you touch the actual name, once visible, you'd get a kind of a spider graph interactive thing about similar things. So I'm wondering what the appetite in the group is for playing around with an idea of doing a globe that appears in VR, completely blank, just a globe. And then you have interactions, so you can choose to see current weather, fires, all that stuff that's been done many times on flat programs, but also because it is geographical and there's only one Earth, it shouldn't be super hard to be able to pull in almost any kind of data for the viewer to overlay the planet. I think this could both be useful and it could help people on a normal put your VR headset on to be reminded of our environment and our responsibilities and so on. Over. There's got to be some thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, my immediate take is, I mean, I've seen, albeit not in VR, but I've seen things like, sure, I recall seeing things like fire data and drainage patterns and forest cover and stuff done onto effectively a 3D render, albeit in a 2D presentation. So I'm sort of, and you can do fly-throughs on Google Earth. So I'm sort of wondering what is extra here. And the other bit where I'm a bit lost is I'm not sure how the overview effect plays into this. The overview effect, I thought, was it gives you a sort of sense of awe and distance. It doesn't necessarily mean engagement, which is what we then talked about in terms of stuff. So I mean, it's not that I'm arguing against sort of doing it, but I'm not quite sure where the draw is. And I mean, I do understand what the effect is. I just don't quite see how it matches up.
Well, this organization that's doing this video, because it was a non-interactive video in VR, I was actually impressed at the, excuse me, I'm so sorry, the feeling of scale. So being already quite, at least I'd like to think I'm a bit woke, to use that term, you know, about and aware of the environmental issues and so on. It was actually quite impressive to not view it on a laptop or a desktop screen, but to actually have the Earth in front, you know, and to just see it. It gives a sense of awe for sure. And I think there are two benefits to doing something like this. The second benefit, to start there, is the practical, seeing what's going on in the world, being able to flip back and forth. I mean, almost anything could be there. You should be able to even tap on different areas to listen to radio stations, as has also been done. Weather and all kinds of, political coverage. Now that we've had an election here in the UK, you should be able to see that, whatever. But the first one, I really think, imagine you put your headset on, and every time you start this thing, the Earth is really, really tiny. And let's say it takes 3 seconds for you to, at hyperspeed, get close to it. So it becomes usable speed, this size. I think that really might, judging from what I experienced today, help get people to feel, wow, who's ever lived? This is where everything is happening, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, Fabienne, I can't really see well on this phone, so please don't use hand. Just please interrupt as you want. Sorry about that.
Oh, we're not hearing you, Fabienne. You're not muted, but it's not coming through.
And now is it better?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so hi everyone. I think I see two aspects maybe to disentangle. One is the more emotional part, maybe with a bit more storytelling, like we want to make people feel, I don't know, it's terrible, we need to act now, or oh, it's really threatening, let's change our habit, or a more analytical viewpoint, which is like, okay, we have a data set, the data set applies to that sphere, which actually is us, and I want to understand it better in order to act. And I think it's a bit different. The first, because if it's the emotional part, the storytelling aspect, it's a bit more studio mode. Doesn't mean the impact is not good, but it's very different kind of work. If it's more analytical, then I'm going to share a little something. And I would argue it's closer to the work of most people here in the group. Yeah, it did happen last week or so. There is the Statistic Institute of Belgium that I happen to follow on Twitter. And what I did was they published something, and honestly, I did not hear so much about it. It was on the real estate price list, but I just use it as no, it wasn't actually even on that. It was on bankruptcy. Yeah. But so my little exercise was to take the data out and make a visualization and start to think about their data set in a different way. And I used Observable. I don't want to make it sound like I'm promoting the tool. I think it's a great tool for computational notebook. But why do I mention it? Is because they have all those little inputs or widgets. So in the widgets or snippets, they call them, they have inputs and also visualization like plots. And you can basically drag and drop them. Let's say if you drag and drop a search input or a range input here, it's going to make everything follow that it's reactive. And I think why, sorry, it's a bit of a convoluted answer, but I'm coming to the conclusion. It means, I think that though is very interesting, the fact of taking input or data sets or visualization and drag and drop and refine. So if this kind of interaction where we have an Earth or a global data set related to a topic and we can play with it and dig or zoom in and out, I think that's pretty powerful. And I haven't seen it, but yeah, then it means also re-implementing, let's say, some kind of equivalent of all this in VR. And I don't know how pleasant this kind of in VR analysis of a Earth-wide data set would be. I have no idea, I didn't try. But I think yeah, I'd be curious to see that kind of outcome.
That's interesting, Fabian. I certainly see I sense the same issue you do about sort of disconnecting the sort of the emotive layer and the actual sort of information layer. Because to a certain extent, part of the problem with some of these things is whipping lots of people into a frenzy that something must be done doesn't necessarily actually help. It just means there are more people blaming somebody else for not doing anything. Although it may seem prosaic, I think, you know, the ability to show relevant things, which I think is what you've just shown, speaks to the heart at, actually gets us further. Sort of being able to see all the bad things in the world may just make you feel sad or angry, but it's not it doesn't of itself solve anything. Whereas if we can, it's more taking
Sorry,
the
I'm
data
back.
to, it's more, it's a sense is making the data to at least prompt people to begin to ask questions that are actually pertinent. Rather than saying, I see this and it upsets me, and somebody else should do something about it, which is where a lot of our sort of our presentations, often not ours, but I mean in general this area, tend to get us. And that's not trying to be glib about it. I mean, it's just recognizing that often we can see something that's very lush, that gives us this sense of a motive engagement, but we not then equipped to drill down into its meaning, other than be left feeling that something ought to happen. But unless something does happen, that's actually not necessarily a beneficial thing to do to large numbers of people.
Yeah. Okay, I just reconnected, so I could hear that. I just wanted to briefly mention to Brandel what we're talking about. I'm delayed today because I randomly came across this group doing a VR experience at the Royal Society on the overview effect, the effect that astronauts have when they look down on Earth. It was okay. I think technically even we could do better right now, but it brings the idea of doing a proper globe, but doing a globe you could put a lot of data onto, where initially there's nothing. It's just the globe, no lines or anything like that, for two reasons. One, to give people a sense of wonder, and also, as Mark was talking about, put a lot of data to help visualizations over.
Cool. Yeah, I feel like geospatial like organization of information is a good way to collate and present things, and it would be really interesting to explore kind of a canonical mechanism on the web, in the same way that we have an anchor tag to have a location tag, and for having devices have the ability to discern or decide what to do with that based on some hinting. But, you know, like at the risk of, you know, going down a semantic web rabbit hole, I just think locations are things that that you could get some stuff out of
Yes.
for a start.
I mean, it's interesting because look, there is only one planet currently. Of course, the planet has changed over time, so it's not that XY coordinates or, you know, latitude and longitude is just going to be one God's own truth forever, so to speak. But it is a good starting point. And if you have a mechanism where you can do an amazing view on a globe in VR, and then you can export that in a format to put into a normal document. So you give that to someone, they have an opportunity when reading that, it says, click here for the VR view of the world that I looked at. Boom, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but one bit that's often missing in that is that often the meaning of the data that we can put onto that varies massively due to missing parts of the data. So for instance, if I show you all the things happening in country X, And I don't realize that there's an impassable, very high mountain range across the middle, and they have no domestic aircraft. People start to apply their own context, thinking, so why are these people doing nothing? Look, it's only, putting their hand on the map and sort of walking their fingers across. Anyone can see how close it is. Why aren't people doing things? So in fact, unless you miss things like travel distance or say distance from something like electricity or flowing water or something, a lot of this data that we can or are able to get in data form and show is potentially misleading, because when somebody sees it, all they just see is a number of things are happening, but they don't
Mark,
see it,
all
they don't
data
see it
is
in
potentially
context.
misleading.
Sorry?
All data is potentially misleading.
Yes, but I think that's a slightly good defense of this. I do have some sense of this, right? I think back my time at sea, people didn't understand that, ships can't go at 80 miles an hour, and people said, well, why aren't you there yet? In the middle of a gale and sailing through very rough seas, as opposed to very flat seas, is not only a difference in speed, but also a significant difference in danger. And I just make that point because it's a way of bringing it across that it's not just a matter of saying, well, everything's possibly, open to misinterpretation. The thing is, if to take your opening thing, if we're going to take things about, I think something like fires happening on the planet, and present it in the relation to climate change, if we just show people that there are bad things happening all over the place without really a sense of context as to what is actually available to sort of deal with that,
I don't agree with you at all.
I do think
actually.
it doesn't help.
I don't think it agree. I don't agree.
Okay, that's fine. I'm
Because-
just saying I do think these things often end up going to an unintended effect.
It's a bit like saying there's no point having Google or the internet because all data is not online.
Not at all. Not at
What's
all.
the difference then?
Because whoever didn't get it is, but if the data is taken, it's presented in a globe, and the starting point is, let's have an object of awe. So let's people feel awed about this and drawn into it. That's where it steps across the line from just looking something up in Google, because we're starting with an intent to create an effect, and we're leaving, albeit unintentionally, we're leaving out some information that makes it usable and tractable to the viewer.
What are we leaving out that would make it more tractable for the user?
Look, I've just explained. Sorry.
No,
did you
but for
miss
the-
that bit?
No, hang on. The initial point is a globe, nothing on it. And then through different mechanisms, which would be interesting, the user can choose to view such things as live weather data. That's relatively simple. Also, forest fires, these things are available. So that stuff is there. But yes, of course, there's a ton of data. Like yesterday, WHO said that the COVID deaths are likely 3 times worse than reported. So yes, you can't just take COVID deaths reported in India as a prime example and overlay it and believe it. Of course not. There are different reporting standards, but I don't think the fact that there could be a potentially powerful tool for showing the data should not happen just because some data is missing, misleading, or biased. That literally is
no,
throwing
I
the
don't
baby
disagree.
out
It
with
shouldn't
the
be shown.
bathwater.
I'm just saying there's a responsibility in displaying stuff and making in unintentionally oversimplifying the results of what one's showing. That's as simple as
All
that.
right, fair enough.
Yeah, no, I think I take Mark's point, which is, am I audible? Yes, I am.
Yeah, you sound good.
The point that I take from Mark stuff is that the source of data may have characteristics that can be buried by a given visualization. So there's a really good talk by Avik Barzayev back at his time when he was at HoloLens. The audio is terrible, but the talk is good about what is a location. And he opens with saying, where is the Eiffel Tower? I think this is to do with both Eiffel Tower and Statue of Liberty. Anyway, and because there are there are a few of each, and what you mean by its location, because there are ones that are replicas. You know, the Tokyo Tower is, I think, the same shape as the Eiffel Tower, and just painted and awesome. And there are miniature, but otherwise actually pretty accurate statues of Liberty in like Vegas and stuff like that. And some of the information that you may convey about the specific thing, like lat long, is not really helpful if what you mean is how do I get to it. What you really want more is like how to go to the Staten Island Ferry when it's busy. And so in that sense, what he's talking more about is the intentionality behind a question about what a thing is or where it is, sort of obscuring, being obscured by people kind of excitedly rushing to be able to convey a certain dimension of information. I think one of the things that Mark's touching on is that the aspect of the provenance of data can at times shine through a little bit more through, for example, textual kind of pieces, textual relays of it, and that glossing over some of the potentially, say, thornier characteristics of what a piece of data actually is by virtue of simply sweeping straight to putting it on a globe has the potential to normalize and assimilate it into a form where it's harder to see what it was from and the manner in which it sort of differs based on probabilities or like I said, like provenance, like or the agendas there too. Like I actually feel like weather data is intensely not canonical because of the difference in the way that different agencies and entities may report on particular things. Like it certainly would have the ability, but so would land borders, and there are islands that are shown bigger to Chinese nationals than others, and in different political colors as well. So like there's very little that we can't politicize, and so yeah, like I do think it's kind of a case in point there that and you know that the fidelity of the data is intensely political as well in terms of what NOAA produces in the United States, and kind of is often limited to being allowed to show. Like if you've ever read The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis, or know about the history of that blight on public services AccuWeather, the national oceanography and other data organization is prevented from being able to advertise or even sort of notify people of the fidelity of data and the freeness of its availability, because it would be anti-competitive to people who package it up and sell it for a profit by combining it with wizardry that tells you how allergic your dog is going to be on a given day. God bless America. And so yeah, like I think it is interesting. I don't take that as a reason not to do it, but as a challenge to representations to be able to say like, well, what is here, and how can we make sure that those things come through? My hope with greater fidelity of data, similar to Nelson's, Ted Nelson, is to say like, if we can come up with slightly more dimensionality to what data is, then potentially most people, at least many people, will have the ability to discern the shape of valid data. We'll be able to identify the telltale signs of somebody having tinkered somewhat with something in order to be able to kind of create a bias. And the mere sort of presentation form and availability of different additional channels and details of data should be able to tip at least some people off that something is amiss, and assist them in being able to do the digging to say like, hang on, this isn't in agreement with the geosurveys done by the United Nations in 2017. I think you've buried some bodies here, maybe literally, maybe figuratively. But you know, like to that end, I still strongly believe that that a geotag would be more than worth its sort of trouble in terms of what it would be able to add to our kind of lexicon, and reminds me actually of the Bellingcat open source tools and the for those of you not familiar, or if I haven't told this group before, but you know, Bellingcat, the open source intelligence sort of group, releases all of the tools that they produce, things that tell you about the kind of reflectometry and angles of attack and things like that people have used in order to be able to make determinations about the validity of Russian or Ukrainian claims about loss of material and life and stuff like that. And the forensic architecture group as well have done some really amazing things there. So yeah,
absolutely different categories of what could be more considered fact and what could be more considered, biased. Tomorrow for lunch, I'm saying an old high school friend of mine who used to run intelligence for half of Afghanistan during the war. And he won't tell me much about what he did, annoying little bastard that he is. But it's interesting to hear generalities of how he has to deal with intelligence, because he had to decide what intelligence was actionable. So there was a very specific thing of, by the way, you ever meet this guy at a party? He's warm and friendly, but his day job was essentially this and this data is correct. Yes, go kill those people every day, right? Absolutely crazy stuff. So of course they made mistakes. I'm not defending NATO or anybody. I'm just saying in terms of process, I do agree, Mark, that at least for some of the non-obvious data, such as, clouds are okay, probably. And then maybe other things, there should be some sort of a process. So the initial thinking for me is, it gets really complicated. So let's imagine you put your headset on, tiny little dot, takes 3 or 4 seconds to go into full view, just to remind you it's small, right? Absolutely nothing is visible unless you saved from previous sections. So now all you can do, and the physics will be interesting, will the Earth be heavy to turn? Right? At what distance should it be rendered? Probably 0.5 meter to 1 meter in front of you, no matter what size it is, right? These are the things we're beginning to learn by using it. But then also, let's say you touch the United Kingdom and you then get a border around it with names of the countries and so on. How then do we further allow you to investigate stuff? You could just tap on a name and then you get a chart or whatever. But the actual act of, let's say you used the example of Ukraine, you move across to Ukraine, you tap on that. There should be a process whereby I will now view the American defense open data about what they believe happened. So Mark, your annoying point earlier is annoying, of course, because it is relevant at stages like that. So yes, not just the hand movements for an interaction, but the actual, what do people think it is when they get it? And yes, I'm sitting down now, but I'm still not on a laptop. So a question about the feeling for you guys is, the reason I did InterAtlas, my atlas that showed nothing except when you tap, was because Google Earth showed stuff all the time. And in the early days of doing this stuff, you had all these choices, but Apple and Google both wanted to make things really, really simple for some reason. I mean, I'm being facetious. Of course, they needed to do that. But that's why I did InterAtlas, to help people learn countries and cities. Because it's like, oh, is that so-and-so? Tap, and there it is. It's hard to learn what is written in front of you. I decided to do this just because I felt I had to. With something like this, it's very easy to think that there'll be a lot of competition, a lot of small companies doing horrible versions, and then big companies doing big versions. I'm waiting to hear back from Google and Isabel at the Linnaean. I certainly have not dropped it. But I do think that a research-minded group like us, if given access and a bit of funding, might produce something that is much more, dare I say it, usable than a whiz-bang, I got to make money out of it, or a big company showing off something. What do you think?
I think the challenge for us is to figure out how we can use visualizations to indicate causation versus mere correlation. You're not going to convince people to do something if they're not convinced that the results that they're observing are connected to the actions that they're taking, or that the actions you propose they take are going to have an impact on what it is that they're observing.
I think that's fair enough. The thing that I attended today, the first half an hour, was a discussion on climate damage, and it was actually quite shocking. For instance, the loss of biodiversity over the last 100 years that has been measured is actually the same as when the dinosaurs were killed, 75%. You know, there are so many numbers on this, and then it shows where this comes from, what kind of pollution we do, all that stuff. So when it comes to that aspect of it, I think that's something that could be done in this. Of course, it would be amazing to have some sort of a timeline slider underneath the Earth, maybe that appears when you need it, and you can see changes over time and so on, absolutely. But just in terms of, I mean, imagine the Knowledge Navigator video from a long time ago, right? Imagine if in that video, because he talked about some Amazon stuff in the back then, didn't he? He puts on a headset, he has literally the whole world. And some stuff can be brought forth and put into presentations and back again. Maybe this could be the most important thing we can do to help people understand our relationship with, as far as life is concerned, everything. But then I'm prone to being hyped up about the latest thing. So, you know, that's just me. So Brandel and Fabian, both of you, if as a test with no interactivity at all, just taking a high resolution globe into a VR space, and okay, let's say I have one interactivity, like with a mural, you can just scale it and then move it about. Is that a lot of work? I have the texture for it. It took me a ton of work to do.
Oh, we're playing Globe? They're around, yeah. But yeah, no, like NASA has plain EquiRex. It's generally
I took the one from NASA and I worked on it a lot because they have different times of year. So you have to choose how much snow you want to see. And also there's the question of how much you can see into the ocean. So I colored all the oceans blue and then I played with the transparency level. So you get a sense of the ocean without it being as detailed as land. So there was kind of, so even that was an interesting level of polish that had to be done. But wouldn't that be a fun thing for us to just see what it would feel like having in front of us? Is it going to be like Noda sometimes and too big, or will it be interesting? Fabian, you said what?
I don't know the answer. You know the answer. Meaning, with the hubs we spoke, if you have a 3D model of a globe, you can put it there. Or if you have the texture, I don't know what texture type it is. Is it like an equirectangular projection?
Yeah, I mean, it literally is a rectangle that wraps on a globe.
Then, then you should be able to do this yourself. And once you put it in hubs, or if you put it in hubs directly, actually, rather than spoke, then it means you can already move it around and grab it and scale it. So you tell me.
We try to do that now.
Yeah, for example.
Is it worth our time if I can find the graphic?
Yeah.
Yeah,
desktop VR has you know, people made a Google Earth VR. I don't believe the team is properly supporting it that much anymore, but it is pretty interesting, and they have a globe a mode as well as being able to get down into Street View and things. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that is too demanding for standalone headset, so it needs to be explored with a PC. But you can do it with the Quest 2 with the Oculus Link attached to it, which is cool. And it is interesting. One of the interesting questions and sort of challenges. Oh, we lost him. One of the interesting challenges with it is that seeing a thing that big to the side of you makes you feel more ungrounded, because there's no fiction in wherein like it's on a floor that is anything like yours. I don't know if that's been your experience in Google Earth, Fabian, but I find that disconcerting. And then you can live with it underneath you, which is obviously the most appropriate when you're at much bigger sizes. But yeah, it's an interesting sort of tension and challenge as whether it's here or whether it's here, and when it's appropriate for age. And I think Google Earth gives you the choice to do either one and leave it up to you. But yeah.
I honestly, I'm trying to think back, but I don't think I had any emotional connection with Google Earth. But the little asterisk on that remark is that it's really hard for me to wear different hats. So when I try to explain, like, I can't help but think, okay, how did they stream the texture? How they use the scaling, and then yeah, I can't be emotionally involved in this kind of thing because I just think about how it's been done. So it's a bit, it's a shame, but I tend to have this bad habit.
I don't know what you mean by that. I may have misinterpreted.
That I try to see how it's like I don't know, if you're a painter and you look at a painting and you look at the pigment rather than the big picture, you wonder how the frame has been made and everything, just because you try to not think about how, but it just comes back somehow. So yeah, I don't think I ever had awe or wonder while looking at Google Earth VR. Impressed, yes. Enjoyed it, yes. But awe or a sense of this is our little planet, I don't think I experienced that.
Does anyone know what .pvrtc documents are?
Rings a bell.
Yeah, there is a 3D AR company, I forgot their name, but with a green logo that might do this kind, but I don't know what the file format for.
Having problems finding the images.
Looks like PVRTC is a PowerVR texture compression,
Okay.
which would have been what the default textured compressed GPU compressed texture would have been for the Apple A series, if that makes sense. The default file format that maybe pre-metal hardware accelerated devices made on the Apple A series, like A8 had a PowerVR E6624 or whatever GPU, that kind of thing.
This is so annoying. Searching on the Mac is not ideal, people. Don't know if you've ever noticed. That's a joke.
No, the searching on the Mac, full screen and multiple window management, also not my favorite thing.
No.
We just had a sort of a workshop, a full day workshop, 2 full day workshops this week, where we were sharing via WebEx, like Zoom kind of, and projecting to a large screen in a room, and everything that could go wrong did, in a way that I think might actually be unique to Apple stuff.
No,
Cool.
that happens when I'm giving demos all the time. Just something about the demo makes everything go wrong.
Who is sharing screen, by the way? Yeah, it would be you, Fabian, wouldn't it? I'm very glad you're doing that. And okay, time to unlock the beast. 1 second.
By the way, Brendel, do you know if there are any libraries out there for dealing with RTFD documents? I don't care what language, anything that could just like pull one of those apart and access what's in it.
RTFD, I mean, RTFD is actually directory that contains all of the assets and resources. But the actual RTF file itself, I think when I looked at it, there is a JS. There is a JS thing that people have used.
Sorry, Fabian, just typing in there because you're getting kind of exciting things happening there.
Yes, again, you can do it too.
Oh yeah, I am. I'm just looking for my textures that I worked on forever, but it's at least 10 years ago, so they're not screaming hello to me.
So I'll start spoke and so background black. Yeah, and even I forgot, but I was at some point doing like a little competition on like demo scene, very small executable. There were some like this to you can do the procedural version of the Starry Sky. So we just have some background like this moving, or the galaxies and all. It's I'll put some. Yeah, actually, I've done some silly demo for ESA at some point on the. I'll use that. So I'll make a scene and share the link back so that I might just also put some place to stand on rather than just pure space, because that can be a little bit. Yeah.
No, we're supposed to be floating in space.
Okay. So
No, that feels bad. I don't like it.
No, I know it does, but that's the experience today was that, but it was non-interactive, and generally I agree with you. So that's why I'm wondering if, yeah, I'm just wondering if we should try it. But of course, also the idea of having the Earth, you know, even with a drop shadow on the floor, to give it a sense of like a sculpture, like they have at SRI. Have you seen that one, Brandel? In the main SRI?
No, I've never been into SRI.
It's beautiful, big metal thing. Yesterday at the zoo in Copenhagen, they had for the Arctic region, they just had the top. So like a tiny little top of the Earth, like a huge thing. It was really a very clever way of showing that. But anyway, let's see now. Yeah, this is frustrating.
You remember there used to be a Mac screensaver that gave you a representation of the whole world overlaid with live data on earthquakes and lightning strikes.
Yep.
I remember that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that regarding this. That all that data is available for sure. How are you doing, Fabian? Are you ready to share with us soon? I'll put it on the website so it's easy for everyone to go to on the futuretextlab.inflow/VR. But what is the general thought of actually trying to do something like this properly? Because doing it like Fabien's doing now, with all due respect, is relatively simple, but I think trying to make it useful will be quite a big thing, actually. And potentially useful if we deal with the different realities.
Yeah, I mean, what it makes me want to do is check with the people in W3C on W3C Whatwig inside Apple about what has gone before the committee with relation to location.
That's really good. That's
and-
really good.
And think about what kinds of things we could encourage, because micro formats is a thing that gets litigated and relitigated relatively constantly, and so one of the things that I'm really interested in, and what I believe we Apple, and this is actually speaking as a representative rather than shying away from it, should do with Model is seek small, minimal kind of examples where it can provide them improvements and capabilities for people being able to put 3D things into a web page without necessarily stepping on WebGL's toes. And in that same vein, but where it's limited in terms of its scope, so that we don't end up with just absurd complexity burdening a new API that people can abuse in all sorts of ways. So I wouldn't want the kitchen sink in terms of capabilities in terms of being able to do geospatial things, and so just the absolute minimal closure over the first useful set of capabilities and functionality that we can imagine. That would be really nice. And so I'd like to pursue that. I mean, Apple actually does have, in the same way that there's a Google Maps API and you can embed maps and stuff like that. There's an Apple one. We don't publicize it as much, but I believe Apple uses it for giving you the location of retail stores online. And I believe third parties can use it. I don't know if we've ever discussed licensing or anything like that, but it's written in such a way that it would be amenable, kind of thing. And so, yeah, like between those concerns, like what does location mean to us and how can we convey it on the internet? I think is an interesting question, both from the perspective of what we own and what we're concerned about, and stories that we've attempted to tell in the past. I know that was an intern in a research group last year and the year before. She was here both years, and she did some neat stuff with news and presenting it first and foremost on the globe. And I'd love to hear where she went with that and if she's coming back. So those are things I'm going to be doing.
That's pretty good. Right, so this is the link that I always use for posting the stuff that we do. So under there, it's Fabien Globe Test, so you don't have to type it in every time. Yeah, the interesting thing, Brandel, when I saw the one today, and that of course wasn't interested in borders, was all about the overview effect. I didn't like the way that the atmosphere seemed to be too big. That was an issue, because the famous thing, if you have a football and you wrap paper around it, the thickness of the paper is our breathable atmosphere. It's that thin. But it did show a little bit of the aurora borealis, which was interesting, which is probably too much for this. But also things like being able to change the transparency of the oceans to see the bottom of the ocean, or even to change the transparency of the oceans and the seafloor so you can see through, so you can see where things relate. All these purely aesthetic visual things in itself could be really interesting to help people give a feeling that goes a little bit beyond like the kind of globe you'd have in the living room. Anyway, I'm going in to see this. Anybody else joining me? Fabien's current masterpiece. Oh, please don't tell me I'm out of power. I'm out of power.
It is a frustration. I'll see where I am.
I forget that it does use power when it's idle.
It can go into a low power state, but it's not guaranteed that it will correctly identify that it has no job to do.
Mark, are you going to go have a look?
And I am on low power as well. It's just not simply not dead yet.
I can't hear you, Professor Anderson. Sorry, Dr. Anderson.
All right, now, well, I think I need to stand up to do it. The trouble is, my desk is so constrained that it's not safe really to be sitting using the VR at it. And then I always have the problem with then what, because this is my main bugbear at the moment. It's a practical thing. Is if I could just see the URL that I'm looking at on this screen, in just have Oculus to just say, you know, show me the URL of the front browser screen or something, would be.
But Mark, that's why we have the URL, the futurelab.info.
Yeah, I know, which I've been starting to use, but I'm just saying as a generality, it's.
Oh yeah, completely agree with you.
Yeah, no. You're absolutely right, and it's been a really kind of thing that you've done that and make it easier to see these things. One thing actually that occurred to me actually as I was watching Fabian working on this is that often occurs to me, and it's something that again thinking back to days as a mariner that people really struggle with is sort of relative size and relative distance.
Right.
This cow is close, that cow is far away. So when you, for instance, one of the things that when you see a globe, I mean, it can actually, in a sense, sometimes be unhelpful because that you see an artifact, you see an object that you have seen presented to you before. So the fact that I can see the whole of Africa still probably doesn't help me really make sense of, I don't know whether Central African Republic is how big compared to the city that I live in or the country I live in. And you may be able to sort of squiz the map around so you can see both at once. But I'm also conscious that even that doesn't quite help. So you know they're a different size. So one of the sort of useful things, in a sense, that I think would be useful in doing the sort of thing we've been talking about is thinking about affordances to help with that problem, because most data sets you'll get aren't going to help you with that. They'll just give you data to put on a substrate.
Well, we're not. Yeah, I mean, comparing different parts of the globe, sure, but you know, the experience of being in this thing
it's not.
today.
You know, that's okay. That's true, but I was trying to make a slightly different point. It's sort of when I'm looking at this, it's understanding. So often when I'm looking at the scale that I can comprehend, which probably will be more zoomed in than just looking, you know, down from space kind of thing. Right. Understanding, just having a sense in the moment of how big the thing you're looking at is.
Yeah. In
a way that relates to something that you actually have some understanding of. And, you know, it's a difficult thing to do. So, I mean, what I'm suggesting is, I guess it means two things on the practical level. What affordances, extra affordances, if any, need to be put into, as it were, the model to enable that. And having, I mean, the easy part is to say it's difficult to do the relative sort of size judgment thing. How you then unpick that in a way to help people, especially those who have limited understanding or experience of using maps, apart from getting from the, you know, car park to the thrill ride, you know, which is perfectly valid, but compared to someone who is a cartographer or someone who's, you know, walking using maps every day, they'll have very different experience of what a mapped set of information means. So I think one useful thing to, you know, to build on your opening point, Fred, really is a sense of being able to add some sense of relative scale.
But Mark, it would be really nice if you just put your headset on and experience it, because it is a really different thing than thinking about it. That's why this Royal Society thing today was kind of a revelation for me. So now that I'm in, okay, I'm going to use my fake hand. Can I actually? So, oh yeah, okay. You're standing in front of me. It's harder for me to move. Fabian, could you move a little bit to the side? Utopia? Who's Utopia? Okay, thank you. No, I understand what you're saying, but just seeing it like this is quite incredible, actually.
Sure. Hold on a sec.
This is really, the fact that we can do this in the course of a conversation, don't you all think it's a bit mind-blowing?
No, I'm afraid I'm dead inside.
No, I know it's technically nothing. It's a sphere inside a sphere, you know, and that's not what I'm reflecting on. I'm reflecting on the fact that we can literally, yeah, okay. Obviously, I would now like to do the twirly bit and see different information things and et cetera, of course. But in and of itself, it's amazing. Hey man, I can actually see you.
Here we go. Here's the relay. Headset off, glasses on, read screen, try to remember long URL, try to remember the URL of the site I'm supposed to be looking at.
You don't have to remember it.
No,
Type the letter F and it's there.
But the more you, yes, but the more you use something, the more you remember it. And I don't use it every day. So it's not something that chunks easily into memory.
I'm just saying that the browser remembers when you type F. What do you say?
Well, it didn't seem to when I was just trying it just now.
Are you ready? Tega's going to come in. Yeah, quick. Is it working? Look this way. See the Earth? The cable has to be in right now. Look up. Is there a big Earth?
No,
What do you see?
black.
Oh, it's black. Oh, maybe because of we went out and in again. Let me just check that. Go with that cable. Oh yeah, that was because we went out and in.
Mom, Daddy, I want to see it. Then I didn't get to see it.
We'll have to look at it later. I'm in a meeting. We're discussing it and all kinds of exciting things. Can you close the door, darling? Thank you. Sorry about that. So what does it leave you dead inside, Brandel? Is it because of the lack of affordances or is it because?
No, I am dead inside. I don't have any emotive responses to it.
No, but to this or to everything in general? What do you mean?
But to this, I mean, so I went. There are some things that can bring joy, but yeah, like the visualization of a globe and being able to see it is just not really among them in terms of the.
Brandel, this is potentially just an armature for literally the whole world.
But you know, the question is, what happens to you when you see a globe like that? You know, one of the things it does make me reflect on is what I'm not seeing. What kinds of views it sort of privileges. I've had a long sort of interest in thinking about the fact that, like, you know, in the same sort of notion that the map is not the territory, that the something that lends it, even if it's not a political map, that the something that shows the geospatial sort of boundaries, you know, a shoreline is not political, but it's still a particular point of view that's not particularly reflective of the lived experiences of somebody who doesn't have the ability to fly, you know, like in a literal sense of like being able to kind of hop a boundary and stuff. If you know, so having a globe where instead of actually seeing anything about the shape of the world, you saw the shape of the sidewalk corners, the footpaths and the crossing lights, then that's interesting, but something that we don't have the ability to privilege and kind of put in front of people as a point of reference about how the world is. That I think would be an interesting thing to have the capability for.
I mean, one thing with this particular globe right now, it is the colors are very, very cartoonish. This is a globe. This is not the Earth. So I think one thing we're talking about is at least try to show the Earth, you know, get the best up-to-date photoreal pictures that we can. And it's going to, even with that as a goal, it will be fakery. It will be privileging specific points of view. There's no questions about that. So, I completely agree. But I do think it's thanks, Fabian. That was really super cool. But I do think that, in VR at some point, if things go right, we will be able to do incredible abstract views, like your amazing carpet, so to speak, of conversations, when it's like this. Of course we will. That's amazing. But I do feel that we can beneficially create better views or different views to observe where we live. Fabian?
So I'm going to be a bit of it doesn't also move me. And maybe it's because, again, I focused on the technical aspect. But what could move me is that if I combine the last three things, so what's been done today, you put the globe and you move it, and eventually you have a discussion also with authors on it. Number two is what I showed initially, which was data set analysis like this on the spot. You get information not just from the European or the Belgian Institute of Statistics, but let's say ESA or NASA, and you apply it right away to this sphere, to the globe. And the last thing is what I showed last week, which is embedded the URL. So for example, I shared a URL of the card with the GLB. So if you can have the GLB of Earth, that the one is from NASA, and you have inside it metadata as URL of data, and then you can do the analysis in real time in VR, and that the result of this analysis is a better understanding of Earth, then that gets me going potentially. That gets me excited.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice because I think we're polarizing each other in a useful way. You're looking at the different kinds of data. I'm kind of looking at the more naturalistic aspect of it. So I think just in terms of interactions, if you zoom out, or move away, or however you want to phrase it, at some point you're going to reach the moon, but you can't find the moon naturally. It'll be impossible. Well, because it's so tiny almost, right? Well, okay, we can actually see it from Earth. Of course we can, but to develop ways where you can actually see the whole solar system if you want to in the same thing, right? So you have that experience of context. Because I think in the planet we live in today with so much conflict, any subtle reminder that we live on this tiny pale blue dot, as they call it, I think may have a good result. But that result cannot be just a £5 app you download and then you twiddle around and it's cartoonish and cheap and crap. I think it definitely needs to have the serious data points you're talking about. And I think it needs to look absolutely freaking amazing. The albedo of the snow should be there, the shininess of the oceans. By default, maybe the weather should be there, the clouds as much as we can, unless they choose to somehow remove them. To even choose what the initial experience will be real work. But as you said, Brandel, it would be good if this was built using proper open web components. So that
I mean, something that I've been thinking a lot about is what are the primitives that it would be appropriate to expose to and for the web in a way that minimizes library bloat. I've been talking to people around W3C and WebXR about, like, I don't know about you, Fabian, but I just feel like it's convenient for people like you and me that it exists, the WebXR devices API and WebGL and stuff like that. But they are both fundamentally at the wrong level of abstraction for what web is and what web development is. And you kind of see that in terms of the way that most people struggle to do the webbiest things in both of those things, and it's just a real challenge. That's why I built the stuff that Timeline VR goes in, to be able to render an HTML document, and I, if I were to have my way, which it sounds like maybe I will, then then I would push for bringing the web capabilities or the web sort of point of view on how elements and information can be conveyed in GL and XR and all of these things, because I feel like we'd have a better time of integrating those things and be able to create seamless concepts of these things in the same way that Observable has the ability to.
It would be great if such a project existed and it was called World, Wide Web.
I like it. I like it.
There is also a concept from Trevor Smith called the wider web, which is, let's say, if you're truly responsive, truly across devices, yeah, the web doesn't have to be behind a thin flat screen. So I think it's also it didn't take on for now in terms of usage, but I think it's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and also, Mark, you talked about some naval issues in the beginning. I saw a YouTube video yesterday, and some guy, former Danish naval guy, talking about Russian naval vessels and how they maneuver, how they are very old-fashioned, and they have to do waypoint that rather speed up and slow down to hit the waypoints and all of that. Because some of this is plotted in relatively standard ways, it would be amazing in this context to be able to zoom in to that kind of a level. And if it is truly web open, like you can pay for flight data, to be able to put all these things on top of each other, it's got to be useful.
Except things at sea happen much more slowly than that's another thing. And even crashes happen at actually remarkably slow speed. It's not like someone ramming their jet ski into the side of the thing. Often, if you think about those collisions out in the Far East with a couple of USN vessels, those happened at about 2 or 3 miles an hour. But of course, when you've got two very large hunks of metal with massive inertia, behind them colliding, those 2 or 3 miles an hour. The reason I say that is how exciting it is to watch things. But it's like the true things actually. So when you're navigating along, you are, well, these days you might be navigating along what you might think is a true thing. But here's another case in point about truth. Well, where, for instance, is the edge of the sea? Well, I know, for instance, my old boss, when I was having the Cabinet Office, said, well, it's interesting because the three services define a different way. The Navy want to know where the water runs out so they don't go aground. The Army want to know at what point their feet get wet, and the RAF want to know how close it is to the nearest airfield. So in their topographic mapping, even those things don't align, and that's just in one country between 3 organizations. And so, and that's another actually problem when you come to, as it happens, when you come to just lay information onto a globe, is there are interesting hidden depths to this. But that just speaks to the same things Brandel said. So what that's really saying is this stuff is too crazily complicated for the ordinary person who just wants to take some information in a web type environment and display it in a manner that might help them understand it, but without bending, in a sense, without bending its reality out of shape, and especially without them knowing.
Yeah, but I had these problems when I did the Interatlas. For instance, there are quite a few places where the ocean is not blue, it's muddy. And to actually see the border there is quite difficult, even though it is laid out, on top of that. So that was one issue. But the really hard issue was actually to get the shape of capital cities in the world. Because they're very differently and weirdly defined, like London. Is it Greater London? Is it the London Authority? Is it the Borough of London? Is it no, not Borough of London, but you know what I mean. So there are myriads of issues, and that all get very interesting. And they do need to have a way of explaining themselves, but we can still do some amazing visualizations. But I mean, just imagine, so we have this globe that looks photoreal, doesn't look like a globe, right? And then you have, let's say underneath, you have like the little wheel you can scroll, and it scrolls time forward and backwards, depending on what you're looking at. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Because of course, if you're looking at ships colliding, you want a certain amount of movement to mean something within the scale of that. But let's say you let go and you go back and you can see the actual continents move, why not? Right? But so how do you go from doing minute things to doing absolutely supermassive things. And let's say there is an impact or an actual crash and it's recorded in a way that's accessible. You want to do the opposite. You want to slow time down. You know, if you start with just this amazing globe, it should be possible, shouldn't it? But even if it's technically possible, the interactions to make it an incredible experience will be really tough. It's not just a big ball, to say the most obvious thing in the world about the world.
Yeah, I have done television documentary production graphics of Continental Drift, and you know, there's very little that I could use from that. And it was in Maya, you know, in 3D modeling, rather than anything that you could show in code. Well, you'd probably be able to do it in web these days, but you know, and there's a bunch of post effects on top of it in After Effects and things like that as well. But yeah, like the representation that you would use for being able to show continental drift and potentially, you know, if you had the ability to show the actual shit changing and erosion and raising of coastlines during that time as well, which I don't know who has information that would be able to give you a reasonable sort of concept of that. But yeah, I like to say, because I heard it somewhere, that software is bureaucracy sped up.
Yes.
And so the formalism that you use, yeah, I love it. And I think I didn't come up with it, but I don't know where I heard it. The formalism that you would apply to a software system that was responsible for representing continental drift has next to nothing to do with what you might have for flight control, has very little to do with what you might use for being able to kind of document and describe shipping disasters or naval disasters. And it's the devils that there's so many devils between all of those details. It's terrifying to kind of blink and see their glowing eyes in the night. The challenge, the technical impossibility of being able to do something that does all three is just terrifying. And then going like, oh yeah, weather data. No. Unfortunately, we're not at a point. But to that end, you know, I do think that coming up with web primitives where they at least can kind of find some shred of common point of reference would be the minimal first step toward it. And I for my part will pursue that. I'm like, you know, I will say that I suspect that there are terrible skeletons in the story, in the closet of the story of why we don't have geotags that browsers make use of, and I look forward to the terrible and harrowing stories that the standards committee, who will deign to speak to me about it, are gonna be able to kind of relay. I don't think that said, you know, I still don't think that that's a reason not to continue to pursue it and say like, well, what about if more people had 3D capabilities these days? You know, Google Earth is interesting, but it shouldn't be the web. Google Maps provides these capabilities, but it shouldn't be the web. What can we do? Like, yep. I'm very interested in pursuing that. So
it just made me think of earlier, I think it was you who mentioned kind of links in VR, right? Links to places. So I could imagine, and sorry, Brandel, I'm going to take your company as a theatrical. So, you know, Tim Cook was saying, oh yeah, right. Over to you, Brandel, who will now introduce Apple VR headsets. And, you know, the first thing you do is you put it on, and there's this Earth thing that we have now. And then you show the big thing. You can even zoom out to Laniakea, you know, the greatest structure that we know about, all of that amazing stuff. Then you get close to Palo Alto, for the sake of argument. And at some point, you, through a gesture that is clear and honest, you slip into Apple Maps, because that gives you better affordances for that, right? So this kind of an open web-based globe can be the web. Because imagine us going into this meeting today, right? And, you know, we happen to be in different locations in the world, and we kind of see each other like that, and then we go into something else. It could be an amazing startup screen or finder, like the universal finder that is actually the universe. But it's not at all trying to do everything. It's just trying to give links to everything.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm just thinking, when you say if it is the web in the sense, but do you always want a geographical difference between yourself and the thing you're looking for? Yes, if you want to know how far you are from, the shops or from the place you're going on holiday or whatever. But if you're just trying to find that book that you were recommended, long before, because and let's assume you're not going to buy a physical book, so you haven't got a trail to a bookstore to find it. So I just sort of, I'm just getting a bit confused as to how that meshes as a search device.
I'm just saying that you shouldn't have only one way to find stuff. Absolutely not. I could very easily imagine though having a globe spinning in my room, in my virtual office. And if I do need it, just like I use maps on my laptop, I pull it forth, like maybe I grab it, and maybe the act of grabbing it and pulling it towards me makes everything else disappear. So now I'm in that environment, right, for that. But if I just want a bookshelf, maybe I pull the bookshelf forward. So we haven't even got good mechanisms for choosing how to quote unquote launch an app, right? But if you have these things in the room, maybe they are actually apps. And when you interact with them, the entire environment changes or not, depending on your preference. Like on a computer, if you go full screen or not, you should be able to do things on a little globe on your desktop, or you should be in that world. These are the amazingly exciting things to see how they connect. And
Of course, cesium.
What?
Oh, I was just thinking about so one of the main people who's been good at promoting and talking about WebGL is Patrick, what's his name? Cesium. Remember, Fabian? And it came out Cesium came out of Esri. Patrick Cossey. And every time you build things into a higher level stack and expose things that should be free, you put people out of business. So like Windows 3.1 didn't ship with a TCP/IP socket layer, and so people sold those for money. And of course, we now all realize that it was absolute folly to expect an internet to happen with any scale unless your OS is able to provide that. But that means that buggy web TCP/IP goes out of business. And just thinking about so the WebXR space in an immersive web thing, then there are a ton of people who wanted to be able to do their augmented reality is achieved through something called visual inertial odometry, making use of the fusion between the inertial measurement units and the visual camera flow to be able to do that. And because we don't supply that, nobody supplies that in the browser right now. Then there are a number of companies that have popped up, 8th Wall being one of them. It's pretty cool. You can use it on your phone. It's probably not part of the long-term future for there to be JavaScript-based third-party libraries that provide that kind of functionality. And the same is the case in the context of Cesium. I was just looking online to see, one, what kind of HTML tags exist with relation to geospatial information. It looks like there's actually, just on W3 Schools, but like nothing there that reflects that there are actual things that represent locations as canonical HTML elements. There's data and data set stuff like that. There is time, which is interesting. And then, I think time matters. And so that's pretty cool to think about how people could make browsers and stuff like that. But yeah, like Cesium, then I looked, the next thing was a list of 8 ways to visualize the geospatial data in a web browser. And the first one was linked as a Cesium, which is Patrick's thing, which is really good, but arguably, something that I think if the web were to put its grown-up trousers on, need to roll over and kill.
Honestly, my perspective on this is a bit, I'm completely, how do you say, schizophrenic, I guess, in the sense that as a prototypist, I don't give a fuck about anything. Like, as long as it works, like if I need to use tape, if I need to punch a thing in the wall, if I need to hack an API, I'll do it because I want to see if it makes sense or not, and then I'll toss the whole thing in the trash right after.
Yes,
And so
yeah.
that's one part, I have to be honest. The other part is I just checked, I don't know why it was for, what was the reason, but I've been running my own self-hosted server for 12 years, I think. And pretty much nonstop, like to be honest, maybe it's been down like a day or two in 12 years, but not more than that. And I'm rather proud of it. And I'm doing more and more things that I peel away, let's say, some layers to replace with my own. But the thing is, it's going to sound a bit grim, but I hope I'll die with it, that I'm going to keep on using it for the rest of my life. And I hope that's going to take a little while. But then I'm just saying it's a completely different time frame. And I don't have an answer to this, like some tension that I want to do stuff like right now. I don't care about how, just want to try it. And at the same time, maybe it's going to make sense, maybe it's going to be important, and maybe I'll keep on using for 5, 10, 20 years or more, and maybe others also. So it's a bit, but I don't have any answer to this. And the thing is, I don't know in advance, is it going to be a 1-minute project or a 10-year or 20 years? It's a bit tricky.
Yeah. I on that, I'm absolutely with you, Fabian. Like I have, established that I will tear machines, like not computers, but like machines, sensing devices apart literally to be able to kind of demonstrate something. But at the same time, I'm aware of, based on my sort of involvement in big tech, like I made a decent looking, but I would say probably close to photoreal representation of an iPhone 6 in 3D that I would have had the ability to launch the iPhone 6 with in 2014. And we got the Mac Pro shown in 3D in 2019, and nobody has come close as of 2022 to being able to bless or even countenance the possibility of an iPhone for marketing purposes being represented as a live interactive 3D object. And I also have not succeeded in getting anybody else inside Apple to represent like a product as a 3D object. So I'm conscious, and it's not simply because I'm clever. I am, but not that much more clever that other people wouldn't be able to do it. But they haven't, and so few people have generally on the internet. It's not just Apple. Google hasn't done it. Samsung barely does it. They have marketing sites where they've got marketers to do it, but it's not first party, and it's not a point of view on what the product is. It's some brain genius's idea of how to be able to make a dramatic kind of splash with it, which Samsung is willing to do. But yeah, so I'm willing for us, and I'm glad that I'm glad that I have the ability to kind of tear these things apart, literally and figuratively, to make those things. But at the same time, I think it's critical for us to be able to look back on that and go like, okay, so we did that. How hard was it? Why? How can we get more people to be able to do this? And how can that then join the mainstream of the way that information and discourse is kind of populated and informed by the primitives that normies have the ability to kind of reach for and make use of?
And how could you write
that's
an
what I
article
see.
about that for the journal? Yeah, how could you write an article about that for the journal every single day? Do you remember, Fabian, you sent a VR demo, I think it was you, of somebody who was using a physical device, but they were in VR. So they touched it to do things. Does that ring a bell? Right? So, so imagine that this whole Earth Linkies thing, and then to go to the Apple store, right? This is when it's packaged by Apple. You go to Cupertino and you go to the beautiful Apple UFO thing. And that is the only Apple store there. And once you're in there, you do a clickety link and you're inside their environment. You take whatever phone you have, and then you have Brandel's virtual phone superimposed on top of it. So when you're in the headset, you use the new phone, but you're still holding something. That could be fun. So any rectangle will do, right? So yeah, the opportunities once you can go about in the world are kind of fun.
It's interesting the step that Brandel mentioned about, so having made something, then sort of doing the reflective step of saying, well, was it hard or wasn't it hard? And what were the hard things? And it strikes me when you're referring earlier to, the fact that there are all these massive libraries floating around, which are a matter of essentially of necessity for where we are, state of play at the moment, but which clearly probably don't scale well for a more generalized experience. And it also makes me think then there are almost two levels to that question. What's hard? There's what's hard to do now in terms of from a prototype standpoint. But is that the real hardness? So in other words, once just making something has got easier, was that the real problem? Or do we find, rather as you sort of in a sense alluded to with, well, why haven't we got geotags? And there's probably some ghastly story, somewhere. But it's ruined somebody's life about, yes, this is why we didn't do this, or this is why, well, we want to do it, but we haven't found a good way to do it that doesn't have consequences we don't understand. There's a really interesting chicken egg in that, because of course the process of making the first one or two prototypes, which with genuine intent, normally I suspect have no intention in that way of making a pattern, but in a sense, once you said this is possible, all the others will rush forward. And that's been one of the lovely things I think back about, from the web in the time that I've used it. I really enjoyed the 90s because people would post something and someone said, I did this, and so, oh gosh, with that I can do one of these, and that seemed to be a lot more vibrant then than it is now. But maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, and I'm still in awe about what people are doing. I mean, I'm not suggesting for a moment people got any less inventive. I mean, I'm constantly wowed by what I see going on. But I suppose in a way the pool of people playing in it's got a lot larger, and that's perhaps why it seems a bit more.
Yeah. Well, so one thing you were saying that people all rush forward once somebody has sort of created an existence proof. I dispute that. I think that there are a number of things where. So it's just it's out of the box. Obviously, sometimes that happens. But I would actually amend Alan Kay's the first. The best way to imagine the future is to invent it, is to say that's the first part, and then you have to connect it back. Because otherwise, as we've seen with Doug's stuff as well, it's like a lot of people failed to connect it, and then it's not the future. Then it's just a dream that you were able to render a little bit more concretely than the rest. And that scares me. I don't want to be out where nobody can follow. I want to make sure that what we do has the ability to impact the mainstream, not just because I want to, have something cool named after me, but because I feel like the world would be better off if we can dream and then pull it back. And so yeah, that connection back to go like, what about this is intrinsically difficult, and what about it is plumbing that people have the ability to kind of improve on, and what are the sort of the compromises that are intrinsic in what we are privileging, and given that we can't be neutral, how do we feel about those?
I had a conversation with my student today about inventing. And of course, we've here talked about the difference between dreaming and fantasy is very different. Fantasy is boundless. Dreaming is trying to find something far. But this whole thing about drawing back, I think we have slightly different perspectives there, and maybe it's just a different language use, where there's a very different thing. Dreaming far ahead, I find really, really hard. And I know the one thing I have is a good imagination. I lack a lot of intellectual things, but I do have that. But I know that I can only dream certain steps ahead, and then I don't know what it would be. So of course, there's the dreaming, and then of course, implementation is very, very different. That has to be reality-based. But I think what you're saying, and I think what I agree with, is implementation doesn't just happen in a device, it happens in other people's minds.
So if the idea of the dream doesn't connect with them, you can build it and they won't know what they should come to. Right, so connecting back, yes, has to happen. I just wanted to see if we're using different language and mean roughly the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for me, the connecting back is also to simplify those steps to then go, I did all of this, but you just have to press this button. Or, you know, you have to see this and you have to do it in that way. And like the way that I structured my 2016 talk on how to do WebGL was to sort of point out all of the nasty stuff that you've got to do in order to get a WebGL context up, and saying like, please don't follow me here, just use Three.js and do this. What I hope to do once model tag is ready for prime time, which wasn't for the developer symposium at Apple this year, is to say like, here's how I made Mac Pro. Now you don't have to do any of that. You just put a model there and press play. And that means that all of my work should be wasted, and I'm glad for it. Yeah, I just by recognizing a need and negotiating with other people about where their priorities are, we should be able to simplify down until it's no longer as exciting. And that's sort of territorially challenging for some trailblazers, because they sort of value the struggle in a way that means that they want to be able to protect the eliteness of that status. I personally want to undermine that eliteness at every turn by defanging and descaling everything that I've struggled to be able to build in order to make it so that other people can make me look stupid.
I got the greatest compliment I ever had from Ted Nelson this week, when I told him that I got my I got my PhD with revisions, and he said, I'll maybe have to try to use your software someday. You know, he just, I love him.
It is a compliment.
Yeah, he does have that thing of, it has to be way advanced. If it connects with any reality now, it's not good enough. And I agree with you, Brandel, that's not very useful.
But it's interesting to hear Brandel say that, because I think, I suppose, where a lot of my work has been and still is in the layer of sort of moving from the it's possible to can anyone else use it, and sort of saying to people, it's great, but no one can, you know, it exists, but it is not usable. People saying, but you're just, you know, you're just not imagining it the right way. I said, no, this is the reality where people are using it. This is where we are. We need to find a bridge. And it's a bit like any organization you ring up and you say you have a problem. They tell you you not have a problem that they recognize. Please come back when you have a problem that's in our script. And it's that same sort of disconnect. It's sort of there in all of us. So it's easy to sound judgmental about it. I don't mean that. And I really like the point you made that, you know, there's a lot of stuff that needs to get thrown away. We need to, you know, hold ourselves to the grindstone to do that. And I'm really glad to say, yes, you know, and all that stuff I did will not be needed, and I'm happy. And I think that's the right way to look at it, because it is a lot, you know, there's a lot of work that goes on. There's a lot of hard work at the time that absolutely needs to be disposable, because if it's valued too much, it's just cruft that gets dragged along to no effect. And then, you know, 10 years later, people are still describing something we didn't need in the first place.
So talking of reality, before I forget, new version of Author looks like end of next week. The only improvements are on the map. If you make a defined term, it appears on the map in a random location, so you have to put it where you want it. If you want to type your own text that's not a defined term, it can be done. It just becomes italic, so it's a note. And finally, if you select a node and do H, it will hide it, because it's easily very messy. If you then do H without selecting anything, you unhide everything.
Well, by the by, thinking of that, and you mentioning Author, and maybe think of Author documents, and brings us back to RTFD. Earlier, while Fabian was setting up his demo, I was just looking. So I now realize, okay, so I can unpack Liquid as a package. I can look in there. I can find an RTFD package. So inside the RTFD, if I look at the package, is in fact an RTF file and a series of images, I guess, in whatever form that they were provided, put into the document. What's interesting is I can look at the RTF document and I can see where the image goes when I see it in this other rendered form, but I've no idea what tells that. Presumably there's some secret source in the RTF, invisible characters as it were in the RTF binary. It says picture goes here. Is that basically understanding it correctly?
That's my read. I haven't worked with RTF and RTFD, but there has to be some kind of index. There's nothing. I don't think there could possibly be. I mean, alternatively, the path or file name of the image file could potentially do it as well. But that would be pretty obtuse. And
I guess I have to go and look at the
as an
binary.
approach.
I don't know, is RTF, as I remember, it used to be a sort of looked like a series of control codes, but I don't
That's
know
right.
whether,
Yeah.
So there isn't a sort of, I don't need a, so if I get an RTF, I ought to be able to just open up in BB Edit or something and have a poke around.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give that a whirl, actually.
Yeah.
It's
And there-
interesting
and there
to
may be
know how
things
these
that-
bits can together.
Yeah, and
just
there
found-
may be something, because it's not a tree, it's not a hierarchical structure. Quite
Right.
so. Peter, yeah, go ahead, Peter. You
Yeah,
probably
I
know more
just-
about it than I do.
I just found a command line utility that might be of help. Currently, the GNU project came up with a converter.
Cool. Yeah. So my
It's
understanding
in
is that
brew
RTF
too,
is
so you
not
can just brew install it.
cool. My understanding is
reason I
that
brought it up
RTF
was-
is not a syntax tree.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, the only reason I was sort of bringing it up was just thinking of the things we've been noodling around with, amongst our other sort of VR related stuff is, okay, for instance, as we have a method to take a author file and put it into a VR space. So how can we basically use a long screwdriver to lever things into an author document in a prototyping sense, in that spirit, just to get it in. So, in other words, so we can abstract away the difficulty of doing that part, just so we can play with the information in the VR space.
So I guess in closing today, the feeling about looking at doing Globy stuff is very, very spiky. High degrees of excitement for specific areas and very low degrees for other areas. Is that a good take?
So one thing that I would say about with globe-based explorations is, particularly if you look into sort of the first wave of the current sort of generation of VR enthusiasm, starting in 2016 odd. Well, actually, starting with Oculus in 2012, 2013, but certainly once you get to true, decent, and good enough 6 degree of freedom VR with Vive in 2016. There are a lot of globe things, a lot of locations things. So there's like destinations VR. There's a couple of other things where you'll have a globe to navigate to specific places where people have done photogrammetry and other stuff like that. So there are a lot of explorations that have kind of centered on a globe as a navigation primitive. But they're all fairly constrained in terms of their function and goal. It's the sort of thing that a lot of people who have a film effects background have had to do for various reasons, documentaries, like I said, TV commercials. And so a lot of people have, the technical expertise and have had, it's been sort of top of mind enough for people with varying degrees of creativity to kind of conjure up as an imaginative kind of anchor. So it's maybe is less present in Oculus and standalone VR because of comparative power limitations and the sort of the overall texture size limitations, stuff like that. So you know, not saying go buy something, but like a PC with decent VR capabilities will unlock a lot of things that are available in Steam that are pretty interesting to look at and think about, you know, where they go. What I find the most challenging about all of those places, because there's so many really, really good intentioned projects. Like we saw the Powers of 10 VR, all of those other places. Like they don't do enough on their own to warrant being standalone applications. And you know, they were obviously made at a time when web wasn't good enough, and in many cases, arguably, web still isn't good enough to be able to deliver the capabilities that they really want to kind of look for, and the tool chain isn't appropriate for them to be able to kind of do it anyway. But yeah, like I feel like people have explored a lot of fairly narrow things to do with globes and worlds that are appealing, but aren't individually strong enough stories to maintain my enthusiasm. And what would be really interesting is a connective story, like Fabian was talking about, something that has the ability that would definitely be interesting. And that's, you know, what Liz was doing in sort of news incubation was like what is a world that has news about it, and how do you relate those, and how can you go back and forth, and that's, you know, what I hope Don McCarty will be able to kind of support, because Don did like geospatial stuff at Google, didn't he, Fabian? Do you know Don McCarty from like QGIS and stuff?
Yeah.
Because like he left, he quit Google a while ago, but he's now at New York Times R&D. And so I would hope, I mean, he's definitely going to be doing 3D stuff there. My hope is that he will be doing geospatial stuff there and be able to kind of improve those things. I haven't hit him up to talk about what he's doing there and what's interesting and things, but I might to see where he's at, because yeah, I think it's that integrative story of like what the globe plus, and I agree that needs to start with a globe, but given the number of rabbit holes, the number of individualized sort of individual and constrained experiences that have started with a globe, that sort of provocation, absent an ability to connect to other things, is less exciting to me. And yeah, so hopefully that doesn't sound so too embittered about it, but I really like the web, and I really like the seamlessness of being able to connect across things, and I feel like that's important. And I'm done talking. Sorry.
I'll jump back a bit to show something. To me, the spike, let's say, or the interesting aspect, again, it is the interaction with the material, which would be the representation as the sphere and the data, but then the data itself that allows for new representation. And something I tinker with like a little while ago is just the block-based programming, where there are visual affordances allow blocks that are compatible to Snap. And I mentioned this, or I show this rather, because in the end, the goal is to do programming in VR. And if you want to do some kind of analysis of data, it will be okay, not necessarily programming per se, but at least some kind of processing on the data. So I tinkered a bit with blocks in 2D just for the fun of doing it myself, and block in 3D. But what I didn't do it yet, and how to compose them and whatnot, but was to do it in 3D with also the text. So I had a couple of tinkering ideas yesterday on GLTF, and eventually with circling back with additional metadata, like text itself inside the metadata of the GLB. So it might be something I might do, but like I was saying initially, I think the beauty of this kind of interaction in VR, I think that's a hard challenge. I don't think that's if we go back on discussing, looking back at past prototype, I'm rather convinced that this part is going to be the hard part. Like doing some in VR analysis, even shallow one, but that is fun to do by moving some blocks like the snippets in observable. In VR, I don't know, but I think it's valuable. I think it's hard, but I think it's valuable. It should be fun, hard fun rather.
Fabian, I'm trying to make that the language. There's a language you did for kids, wasn't there? I think MIT.
Scratch and Scratch Junior.
Scratch. That's it. Yes, because it reminded me.
That's K.
Right. I do think that's a nice idea of, in a sense, of providing a degree of abstraction for hiding some of the complexity that speaks to this problem that we've alluded to earlier, saying, yeah, well, it's doable, but only for the couple of people, you know, in the room, but not anybody else. So that I think that's a really lovely thing. And by the way, the screenshot I put in the side was me just having a nibble at that thing of, sure enough, if you open up the RTF, the image is in there. I don't pretend to understand what all the RTF codes mean, but the joy is it's sort of code that is broadly readable. Peter might find that of use. But no, I like that idea, Fabian.
It reminds me of Vihart stuff at LABR as well. Proj, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, Fabian, if you want to put an article in the journal, which will then come in the book, that would be amazing on this. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, you know, we look at all these VR opportunities and whatever. And for me, again and again, it just becomes a better workspace where I could put things. You know, like the first thing that I really, really want to put on my glasses to work in. Because sometimes I do use the immersed and stuff, and it's really, it helps to choose the world, but, you know, it's not interactive yet. It's purely there. So, you know, maybe we should at some point talk about if we had to make something useful, what would we expect us first and others later to want to put on a headset when they're working? Right now, there isn't anything compelling apart from specific things, like hopefully the Linnean thing will be specifically interesting when you want to research that, the globe, the same, blah, blah, blah. But what's the kind of entry area? Or maybe that's not the right question. What do you think?
Well, surely some of that's, I was thinking you saying that, you know, so before there was the VR, it's like, you know, the first wearable computers, if I recall, were used for people who were working at places like Boeing, who were half an hour from a workstation if they needed to look up a part number, because they got to crawl all the way out through the fuel tanks and down into the cabin and down the steps and off to the office. So people said, I know what we'll do. And there, you know, there was this amazing sort of man-portable computer. And I think in due course that even had a sort of tiny readout screen, and all, because basically they're doing part numbers. But so that was driven with necessity. And then you think of where people are already doing a fair amount of VR and AR, and it's probably some of it's to do with architecture, telepresence, medicine, one or two other things like that, where effectively, so some of that's delivering skill at distance. So certainly if you're doing a remote operation or a remote consultation by medicine, that's because the wetware with the knowledge is not in the physical location where that.
But what about people like us, Mark? What about people like us? What about people like us? What would you want to put on a headset to have?
Realistically, for the work that I do, it would be having more screens. I may say it with a very small s. I'm not trying to get stuck in this sort of, you know, paradigm of, you know, what it should look like. But a lot of what I'm doing is looking at several things at once and doing constant comparisons, because a lot of what I'm doing, I suppose, at the bottom level is pattern matching that doesn't lend itself to algorithmic pattern matching. So it's stuff computers are remarkably bad at. That, you know, they're not good at knowing what they don't know, whereas a human seems to be able to spot that fairly quickly, because maybe they're looking at different things. So if I could do more of that. But the roadblock for that, frankly, and in that particular thing, but since you asked the question, is simply that the way too much eye strain, and it's just. But so when the technology's got to the point where that goes away, so there's a case of where yes, that's how I would practically use it, and it would be useful. Now it's not, because I can't just get the visual fidelity I need. Plus the fact that I'm not a touch typist, and I'm headset on, headset off, or I'm poking around on a tiny keyboard. And I tend to be using I use a mouse a lot because it's finer control, and a much finer control than I get out of a trackpad. So I'm doing a lot of two-handed work all the time. And again, I find I need to be able to see that. So unless that's actually brought into my VR space as well. But I'm not suggesting I'm necessarily a good prototypical person to suggest as someone who's needing VR. And it doesn't make me antipathetic towards it either, lest I appear otherwise. Far from it. But I would think I'm probably not the best test case to start with. Peter.
Okay, I'd kind of like to see a virtual composite library. Imagine if you had an application where you'd pick 10 or 20 real world libraries and you'd tell the app where the APIs were for all of their library catalog systems. Or alternatively, you used WorldCat and looked to see which libraries had a given title. Then you took the search results and had the VR system automatically represent them as books on a shelf. So it would be as if you were in all 5 real libraries that you were interested in, and the titles from those libraries would then get sorted and placed in card catalog order on virtual shelves based upon the physical specs of the size of the books, filling out the shelves in the same format that they would in a real library. So instead of being in a real library, you'd be browsing the virtual stacks for that experience, but it would be the sum of the books in multiple physical libraries. And if you picked up a book and you flipped it open, you'd get a list of which library collections had that book in them. So you could see that, this book is something the University of Texas, Carnegie Mellon, MIT, and Stanford all decided that they wanted to curate into their collections. Or you could find a book that only one of them had, and you might wonder, gee, I wonder why they put that book in there. And you could also, in my dream world, have borrowing statistics so that the brightness level of each book would depend on the aggregate of how many times that book was borrowed across all of the libraries. So you could really get the sense of this book is really, really hot because you see that the title is visibly glowing on the shelf to attract your eye to it to bring you over. Then you could do interesting things like maybe grab a couple of the books and see what other titles were correlated with them. So by holding a couple books in your hand, then books that were borrowed at the same time as those books had been borrowed would light up and start to glow. Because we can assume that when people are borrowing books, they'll be getting a few books on some given research topic of interest. So if the system knew about batches of books that were simultaneously taken out at the same time, you could get some really interesting visualizations that you can't get in the real world. And then you could even overlay on that a temporal dimension so that you could superimpose borrowing over the course of the last 6 months versus the last 10 years to get different lighting levels. And then you can see that maybe one title was really, really hot for a long time, died out and starting to light up again. And those sorts of visual feedback could help me find titles that I was interested in that I wouldn't be able to find by doing raw search. I mean, I could get all the data, but trying to get all that data and go through it and assimilate it in my head would be a real pain. But that would get me to be wanting to be in that virtual library as opposed to a real library because of all those new visual affordances for finding aids and collection survey results. And I think it also helped librarians who are in charge of curating sub-collections to decide what materials they wanted to pick up.
So one
Okay.
other thing you need in that is you'd need to know why people took the book out.
Oh, good thought. Yeah.
Because they might have just be taking it out because someone's drawn a rude picture on page 46 and, you know, and all the kids in the class have been told about it. I mean, that's just the problem with bibliometrics.
They may need to just dust it. Sorry. Yeah, the library thing is, of course, very interesting. But in the last minute, Fabian?
Yeah, very quickly. I think I imagine I discussed before about processes and how it could be interesting that each of us explicit their processes and see which part of it would be useful in VR or more powerful or efficient than anything else. But I think maybe another way to do this is find the part of the process that we all have in common. And I think one of those moments could be triage, or how we go through a list of 10 or 20 either books or reference or pieces of information and somehow organize it and say, okay, the next one I'm going to read or consume or annotate is this one. We're of course going to each read a different or select different pieces of information, but I think this filtering, this process, we all have in common, and I'm ready to bet it could be interesting or valuable to do in VR. So that could be an interesting exercise to try. And if we do it as an exercise and we really do it, let's say, maybe not tomorrow, that's a bit rough, but let's say in 1 day, 5 days, 10 days, where we each spend just 5 minutes or 10 minutes or really a really short amount so that we don't have any excuse. And we try it with whatever we have, and whatever doesn't work, either because we don't have the tools or we miss some data or some data set is not the right format, then we just write it down and then iterate on that.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I think we should talk more about that. And, you know, all I want is just more of my data around me. I think we're mostly saying that in different ways. Okay, gotta go cook dinner. It's good to be back. Denmark was this week and it wasn't very nice, but it's very nice to be back with you guys. And I look forward to seeing you all on Monday.
Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Good weekend, take care.